The endurance loop, how repetition births conviction. The phrase repeated itself in her mind like a pulse, not because it was true, but because it was there, again and again, until the rhythm felt like memory, and memory felt like belief. We think conviction comes from evidence, from careful thought, from the moment we discover something real. But what if belief is born elsewhere in the quiet accumulation of echoes, in the space where repetition becomes indistinguishable from recognition? Like most of us, civilizations don't choose their truths, they inherit their rhythms. The message heard most often becomes the message that feels most real, not because it convinced us, but because it outlasted our resistance. This is the endurance loop, the mechanism beneath narrative control, the pattern that turns strangers into believers, slogans into identity, and repetition into something that feels like knowing. Consider the advertiser's ancient secret. A product mentioned once is forgotten. Mentioned twice, it registers. By the seventh exposure, the brand feels familiar, not because you decided to trust it, but because your mind mistakes frequency for validity. The brain conserves energy. It labels the repeated as recognized, and the recognized as safe. This isn't manipulation, it's survival architecture. Our ancestors needed to know which paths were traveled, which sounds meant danger, which faces belonged to the tribe. But what worked for survival now works for everything else. Political slogans, cultural narratives, the stories nations tell about themselves until those stories become the only stories anyone remembers. Was it strategy or the simple physics of attention? In 1939, a researcher named Muzafer Sharif placed people in dark rooms and asked them to watch a single point of light. The light was stationary, but in darkness it appeared to move, an optical illusion called the autokinetic effect. When people judged alone, their estimates varied wildly. But when placed in groups, something shifted. They began to converge on a shared answer, not because anyone argued for it, not because it was correct, but because hearing the same number again and again made that number feel true. The light never moved, but repetition built consensus from nothing. Sharif called it a social norm emerging from ambiguity. But maybe it was something deeper. The moment repetition became reality, and reality became shared conviction. What if most of what we believe was born this way? Not in the light of evidence, but in the dark of repeated exposure. Pause for a moment. Imagine belief not as a destination you arrive at through logic, but as a territory you occupy through duration. You didn't choose the ground beneath you. You simply stood there long enough for it to feel like home. History understood this long before psychology named it. Every empire knew that control wasn't about changing minds, it was about occupying them. The Roman Colosseum wasn't just entertainment, it was repetition, spectacle after spectacle, reminding citizens of Rome's power, Rome's glory, Rome's inevitability. The Soviet Union didn't argue for communism, it surrounded citizens with it, posters, parades, anthems. Repetition wasn't propaganda's tool, repetition was propaganda's entire architecture. Even democracies learned the pattern. Election cycles don't educate voters, they exhaust them. By the 100th ad, the 1000th headline, the endless Yunhuan of debate, people stop analyzing. They start recognizing. But what if it never was? The mechanism runs deeper than politics. It shapes identity itself. Tell a child they're shy often enough, and shyness becomes their truth. Tell a community they're resilient, and resilience becomes their armor. Tell a nation it's exceptional, and exceptionalism becomes the lens through which everything else is seen. Carl Jung observed that the psyche craves coherence more than accuracy. We repeat the narratives that make us whole, even when they make us blind. The stories we tell ourselves about ourselves are rarely challenged, because to challenge them would mean enduring the silence between repetitions, and silence is where doubt lives. So we loop, we repeat, we reinforce, until the story becomes the self, and the self defends the story as if defending its own existence. Maybe identity was never discovered. Maybe it was only rehearsed. The advertising industry quantified this in the 1960s. Researchers found that it took an average of 7 impressions before a consumer moved from awareness to action. 7 repetitions to cross the threshold from "I've seen this" to "I need this." But the pattern doesn't stop at products. It applies to ideas, to values, to the moral frameworks entire societies organize around freedom, security, progress, justice. These aren't just concepts, they're repeated until they feel like universal truths, inscribed in the architecture of thought itself. The West repeats freedom so often it becomes invisible, the way fish don't see water. The East repeats harmony until individualism feels like a disruption rather than a possibility. Neither is wrong, both are loops. And the loop always feels like clarity, never like conditioning. But here's the paradox. The endurance loop doesn't just create belief, it creates immunity to counterbelief. Once a narrative is repeated enough, contradictory information doesn't correct it, it strengthens it. Psychologists call this the backfire effect. When people encounter evidence that challenges a deeply held belief, they don't update, they double down. The repeated narrative has become part of their cognitive immune system, defending itself against intrusion. This is why facts rarely change minds. Why logical arguments often fail. Why evidence can be overwhelming and still be dismissed. The endurance loop has already claimed the territory. By the time evidence arrives, the mind has built walls around what it knows. Was it ignorance or architecture? For a moment, consider the distance between what you believe and what you've repeated. The opinions you hold, not because you examined them, but because you heard them enough times to absorb them. The convictions that feel personal but echo the culture, the family, the nation that raised you. How much of what we call thinking is just the sound of loops playing in our heads? The endurance loop isn't inherently good or evil. It's neutral machinery. It built religions and scientific revolutions. It created solidarity and tribalism. It gave us meaning, and it gave us propaganda. The pattern is the same, only the content changes. Consider the civil rights movement. "We shall overcome" was an illogical argument. It was a repeated anthem, a loop that turned hope into certainty, sung until the future felt inevitable. Repetition wasn't the distraction from the movement, it was the movement's engine. Or consider the climate crisis. For decades, scientists repeated warnings. But without the cultural loop, without the repeated stories, images, voices, the data remained invisible. Only when repetition reached critical mass did the narrative shift from fringe to foundational. Repetition doesn't make something true, but it makes something heard. And what is heard long enough eventually shapes what is believed. The question isn't whether we're in loops. The question is which loops we're in, and whether we're aware we're repeating them. What surprised me most wasn't what I learned about belief formation, but how keeping an analog journal helped me observe my own patterns more clearly. Writing by hand forced me to slow down, to notice which thoughts I was rehearsing without realizing it. I wasn't expecting such clarity, and it reminded me that seeing the world differently always starts with seeing ourselves differently. This isn't a recommendation, just something that changed how I process information. I'll leave the link below if you want to explore what I mean. The endurance loop explains why change is so difficult. Not because people are stubborn, but because belief is a structure built over time. Reinforced by repetition, defended by familiarity. To change belief isn't to change a single thought, it's to dismantle the entire loop and rebuild it from silence. And silence is terrifying. Silence is where the self dissolves, where certainty evaporates, where we realize how much of what we know was only ever what we repeated. So we avoid it, we return to the loop, we find comfort in the familiar rhythm. Even when the rhythm no longer serves us. Even when it isolates us. Even when it traps us. Because repetition feels like truth, and truth feels like safety. But what if it was only ever duration? Nations understand this instinctively. The Pledge of Allegiance, national anthems, memorial days. These aren't just traditions, they're endurance loops, repeated until patriotism feels biological rather than constructed. China repeats rejuvenation, America repeats exceptionalism, Russia repeats resilience. Each loop creates a psychological architecture that shapes how citizens see themselves, their history, their place in the world. The loops are invisible from the inside. They only become visible from the outside, or in the moment of silence between repetitions. When the machinery briefly stops and you hear the echo of what's been playing all along. How often do we allow that silence? The most powerful loops are the ones we don't notice. The assumptions so repeated they become axioms. Progress is good. Growth is necessary. Success is individual. These aren't truths, they're rhythms. Repeated so often they became the background music of modernity. And background music doesn't require belief. It only requires presence. You don't decide to absorb it. You simply exist within it long enough, and the melody becomes indistinguishable from your own thoughts. This is how cultures think through us. How nations dream through our subconscious. How ideologies live in the repetitions we never questioned because we never noticed they were being repeated. The loop beneath the loop. The rhythm beneath awareness. But here's the liberation hidden inside the mechanism. Once you see the endurance loop, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize repetition as the architect of conviction, you begin to notice it everywhere. In your own thoughts, in media, in relationships, in the stories your culture tells itself to stay coherent. And in that noticing, a gap opens. A space between the repetition and your response to it. A moment where you're no longer inside the loop, you're observing it. This doesn't mean you escape belief, but it means you choose which loops you enter, which rhythms you rehearse, which convictions you're willing to build through sustained attention rather than passive absorption. The phrase repeated itself in her mind like a pulse. But this time, she noticed. And in noticing, the pulse became something else, not truth, but a question. Not conviction, but a choice. The endurance loop will continue. It's woven into the fabric of human cognition, into the way societies cohere, into the mechanics of meaning-making itself. We are creatures of repetition. We build ourselves through rhythm. But knowing this changes what we build, it changes what we repeat. It changes the silence we allow between the echoes. Maybe belief was never the goal. Maybe awareness was, and awareness always begins with a single question. What am I repeating, and why? The content is for educational and informational purposes only. It does not constitute medical, financial, or professional advice and should not be used as a substitute for guidance from qualified professionals. All decisions made based on this content are the sole responsibility of the individual. If this made you think differently, you've already joined the shadow. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video.